Hey guys. So this is the last round of content for Unit 4. We're going to do perception now because we've spent all of our time up until this point for the sensation and perception unit talking only about sensation. So the first thing that we've got to do as we're moving through this content is differentiate between the two. What ultimately is the difference? It's important to recognize that sensation is not the same as perception. Your brain doesn't sense things, okay? Your sense organs sense things. So your eyes detect light waves, your ears detect sound waves, your taste buds detect the physical energy of food and what it puts out to you, okay? There's a physical scent that is put out anytime you put your deodorant on, okay? So when we're talking about sensory processes, what we're discussing is the physical detection of energy in your environment. Okay. Now, I want you to notice that this is not technically outlined in your notes sheet. So I'd like you to put this down for yourself in somewhere, whether it be at the top of the margin, at the bottom, because I know there's a good amount of space at the bottom of the handout too. But regardless, you need to know what sensation is to be able to contrast it to perceptory processes. So, sensation is the physical detection of energy in your environment and in the world. So, you picking up light waves that are coming off of your computer screen right now. Then, perception is going to be your brain's attempt at organizing and interpreting what it is that those senses have detected for it to process. Okay, so if senses have picked up light coming from your computer screen or your cell phone or things along those lines, then it's your brain that is going about organizing and interpreting what it is that your eyes have seen to be able to recognize that it is yours truly sitting here talking at you. Okay? Same for your sense of hearing. Your ears have physically detected the sound waves that are coming out of your computer or your phone as you watch me right now. Okay? It's not the brain doing that. What the brain is doing is taking that sound that has been brought to it and processing it to make it possible for you to recognize not only that it's my voice, which probably sounds a little different than it usually does because I'm being recorded at this point, but it's also you attempting to follow along with what I'm saying as I'm saying it and putting it down to paper. Okay, so sensation's the physical detection of energy in your world, and perception is your brain's attempt to understand what that stuff is. So that's a very, very, very important differentiation that you need to make sure that you're capable of doing as we move through. So now we're going to talk about how it is that we've gone about attempting to study perceptory processes. So the first kind of perception piece to note is the visual cliff experiment dealing with depth perception. We've talked about different kinds of depth perception abilities that your eyes have. We haven't necessarily discussed what the brain does with those things. And so now we're going to tackle that here. The most significant experience and experiment that we can look to help us better understand how it is that your brain attempts to understand the world around it is through the visual cliff experiment. Because this guy right here shows us the nature part of brain perceptory processes. Okay, so are you born with certain abilities at detecting? I shouldn't say use the word detecting because that goes more with sensation, but are you born with certain abilities to organize the world around you or perceive certain things around you? Or do those processes get learned as you grow? The visual cliff experiment is going to help us to understand that in fact, is very much a nature piece. It is born in you. So they took little babies. You know how much I love all the research on little babies. I just think it's fascinating. So they took little kiddos and they put them on this big glass plane. Okay, so that's what this is right here. I've had some kids in the past that have thought that they were just going to let this baby go over the edge here. No, that's glass that's right under mom. Okay, so they've got these pieces of wallpaper that are placed at different depths. One is just right under the glass plane for the baby to crawl over, and then one is right down here at the floor because they wanted to be able to see when baby's crawling, will they stop at the edge here because they have the ability to recognize the differentiation in the depths, or will baby just keep on trucking over to mom? Turns out that by 6 months, babies will not go over into that deeper end, okay? They will not walk over this edge because they are capable of recognizing that this is at a different depth and distance from them than what this is right here. And so that hesitation shows us that they do have depth perception that we believe is born into them. Okay? So that's an important piece to recognize there. That's not to say, though, that development doesn't have an impact on your perceptory processes either, because that would be a huge falsehood. We know that life experiences influence how you perceive things, okay? But specifically, what we look to is the critical periods in a person's development. If infants miss out on certain life experiences during a critical window, which is for many, 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 many scenarios, the first 3 years of life, because your brain is virtually 85% established by the time you are 3 years old. Okay. If children are not provided with certain experiences, certain nurturing components, their perception will be impaired. We've looked to research on children that came from Romanian orphanages in the fall of the Cold War in Romania, which is in Eastern Europe. A dictator was removed from power there, and there was a civil war that broke out. And at one point, there were 100,000 children in orphanages there. Way overwhelming, that system there. I mean, could you imagine 100,000 kids? That's like, I mean, that's pretty much the population of the city of Cincinnati, and like all being in an orphanage. Okay. And so there just weren't enough adults there to be able to provide them with nurturing or comfort or personal connections. And so those children, if they were not adopted before they were 3 years old, the deficits that had developed in those children stuck with them for their entire life. That's not to say that they weren't able to offset some of those deficiencies, but not nearly to the extent that was possible in terms of improving their development if they were adopted before the age of 3 and intensive therapy could be done to help with regard to language skills and cognition. Okay. Other ways that we've attempted to study this stuff is through animals and deprivation studies. So what they did was they raised little kittens in these cylindrical spheres. So you see this right here, and they're only ever exposed to vertical lines, okay? And so for the entirety of their development, up until a certain point, those kittens were only ever exposed to vertical stimulation. So once the kittens were taken out of those spheres and placed into normal environments, the kittens didn't know how to respond to any stimuli that was presented horizontally. So they would bump into things, anything horizontal. So coffee tables they would bump into. If you would put a toy in front of them and you would hold it up like this, okay, and you'd shake it and they'd paw, 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 go crazy at it. But then as soon as you turn it horizontal, nothing, no response. Cats didn't know how to respond to that stimulus because they had never been exposed to it when they were younger and developing the brain capacity to be able to try to process it. Okay, so being deprived of certain life experiences can very much impact how you perceive the world around you. Now, it's also important to recognize certain influences on your perceptory processes. Have you ever found yourself noticing that you get real hungry and then because you're hungry, every little thing around you signals food? Every commercial you see looks amazing in terms of food, all of the fast food options that are out there. You just can't stop thinking about it, okay? Or you're driving in your car and you suddenly get really thirsty, but you have no water in there whatsoever. And so all you can think about is, oh my God, I need my water now. Or you start to notice that your lips feel real chapped and dry at school, and you realize that you left your chapstick in your car in the parking lot. So all you can think of is just how nasty your lips feel right now. All of those things are ultimately needs, Okay, so physiological needs can very heavily influence how we perceive things around us. So if you're hungry, you're going to pay more attention to things that signal food because you're more focused on those items. Okay, same thing for just being so focused on your thirst or so focused on eating your chapstick at a particular point. Something else that's important to recognize is beliefs. Okay, beliefs matter when it comes to how we perceive the world. What we hold to be true influences what we see. So, in many respects, guys, I know you've probably heard of this cliche question of what's more important, reality or perception of reality. Um, but the reality is, it's more perception of reality than reality itself. Okay. And we look to particularly ambiguous sensory signals. Okay. So things that are out there in the world that could be um, taken in different contexts and not one particular strong way. Okay, so one thing that we can look to is this woman right here. This is Mother Teresa. She ended up passing away before you guys were born. However, this became world renowned in the age before the internet started, where I mean, it made the news all over the place. There was a woman in a coffee shop in Nashville who got a cinnamon bun for breakfast. And she realized that Mother Teresa, this very famous nun who took care of very poor people in the country of India, she felt that her cinnamon bun looked like this woman, Mother Teresa. Okay, so if you look, you can kind of see here is the like the blue band, as it were, of Mother Teresa's habit. Here is the back part of the habit, and then here you've got an eyeball, an eyeball. Here's a nose right there, and then here's kind of like the sagging cheek that she has because she's a little bit older, and here this line right there is her mouth. Okay. There was a circumstance a few years back of a person that had a grilled cheese and they were completely convinced that the face of Jesus was in it. So they put it on eBay and it quickly became known as grilled cheesus, grilled Jesus, right? I think it ended up selling for like $10,000 or something. I mean, it was pretty crazy. Okay, something else that has become very well known in the aftermath of 9/11 is this series of images that just, I mean, it really had an impact on people in the aftermath of September 11th. And you can see in these two images, they were not digitally altered in any way, shape, or form. They've never been manipulated. You can see in this image here what looks like kind of a devil's face. So you can see a horn right there, and then another horn right over here. And then here's an eye, and there's an eye, and then there's kind of just this very creepy, devilish looking smile. Okay. And then you also have this black and white picture here that was taken from a different angle. And again, this was not altered in any way. And you can see a bit of a longer face here, and again, two horns sort of. But there's also a lot of people who felt that it looked, this one in particular, looked like the face of Osama bin Laden, who was the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks that were carried out back in 2001. So um, this is a very, 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 very interesting process, nevertheless, because what we perceive to be real about the world is what it is that we're going to see. So if you think that somebody is doesn't like you, you're going to be looking for all of the different ways with which they seem to present in their behavior how they don't like you. Okay, or let's say there's a teacher that you don't like because you have that perception that, or maybe let's do it this way. You think a teacher doesn't like you, okay? And so because you hold that belief and that perception, you have this tendency then to think that what they do with you and how they interact with you signals that they don't like you. Okay. And so it's important to recognize that beliefs really do influence how we perceive the world. Emotions matter too. We've talked about the significance of emotions when it comes to pain, right? Pain perception. So if you are in a really good, amazing, awesome, wonderful mood and you trip and you face plant in front of everybody, and I mean, like you legit like bite it and eat the floor, okay? If you're in a really good mood though, and it's a great day, you're far more inclined to kind of just laugh and be like mildly embarrassed, probably, oh God, man, like that's awful. Okay, cool. But if you're having a terrible, god awful, worst of worst days and you face plant and just bite it in front of everybody, guarantee the pain you feel there is probably going to be compounded exponentially so because emotions matter. Kids that are afraid of the dark are because they're in fear, they're going to see a robe hanging from the door as a ghost or some kind of noise as a signal of a monster or something along those lines. So emotions matter when it comes to how we see the world. Finally, you've got expectations that can influence your perceptions, okay? We are creatures of habit. And so we use previous experiences of things we've gone through to ultimately help us then understand how things could be later on, okay, or to perceive the world around us at this moment. And so what we call this is a perceptual set. It's our habitual way of seeing things or perceiving them based off of our expectations. They're basically mental shortcuts, okay? And they're really good at helping us to interpret most stimuli and to do so quickly, okay? Because our brains are wired for efficiency. But it's important to recognize that they can also lead you astray at times, okay? So let's say, for example, you had a particular perceptual set coming into this class. You have heard from other students um, perceptions of yours truly. Okay, now those perceptions could differ depending on all different kinds of things. If you know a bunch of people who've had me only in AP, well, their perception of me is going to be very, very, very different. However, if you have perceptions from students who've had me in intro, who told you, dude, you got to take intro to psych, the class is really cool, you're coming in then with a totally different kind of perception of things. So when it came to the first day of class, when I started talking to you guys and I was doing the whole spiel with things, maybe you had heard from another student that Mrs. Hogel is a really sarcastic person. So she likes to joke around a lot. She doesn't really take it all terribly seriously, though. If you'd never heard that before, then you could, in theory, and if you've had this scenario of hearing only from AP kids what I'm like in class, you could have seen me on day one and been like, holy moly, like this lady is just too much. And like, I'm not gonna like this. It's not gonna be cool. Like, she just seems really mean. If you don't have that background on things, you could have a false perception. That's not to say that I don't have my moments where I have to be mean. We'll talk about this in social psych, like it's part of my role. I have to have a certain level of authoritative um, control over you, as it were, because of my position as your teacher. But hopefully, you've been able to figure out through our many experiences with one another that for the most part, I'm pretty laid back where this class is concerned. I like to joke around. I do have a tendency to be sarcastic on things, but I find that it's just because that's a way that a lot of kids can actually connect with me better than kids that find me mean, right? Let's talk about another perceptual set on here. I love to do this one. What do you use to comb your hair? Most of us were going to say a brush, or some of you guys, if you're dudes, you're going to say it's a comb. Because for girls, combs just we get our hair gets too tangly, man. Like it's not good. Here's the thing. What if you don't have a brush on you? Okay, you had your windows down, the weather was really pretty out, and your man bun or ladies, your hair just got hardcore messed up and all sorts of wind blown. What if you don't have a brush on you? But you do have a pair of plastic utensils from the skyline that you had the night before still sitting in your car. Could you use that fork? Yes, you could. Most of you are sitting there like, ugh, that like, oh no. And that's because of your perceptual sets. You have a habitual way of thinking about how to comb your hair. It must be done with a brush. Well, it doesn't have to be done with a brush. It really doesn't. I mean, you could use your fingers. I could do this right now. Okay. Or if I wanted to, I could walk into my kitchen at present, really gross you guys out, grab a fork and just start going to town and brushing my hair. I'm not gonna, because I don't want that recorded for posterity's sake for people to look to later. But nevertheless, you get my point, okay? Sometimes our old way of looking at things based on prior expectations that have been formulated from old experience can lead us astray from time to time and narrow down how it is that we could perceive the world. And so, in many respects, perceptual sets can end up limiting creativity, which is something that you see an awful lot out in the real world in adulthood. Okay, you're seeing this with a lot of teachers with the coronavirus outbreak. They're having to become way more creative with how it is that they get their content out to their students and connect with them in different ways. So finally, let's talk about subliminal messages. Okay, now I'm going to try to move myself out of the way because there's a lot of writing on this slide. And so bear with me. This is one of the last things that you're going to actually, I think this is the last thing you'll have to write down for me because I'm just going to show you a couple of subliminal messages and then we'll be done. Okay. So subliminal messages are those that get presented below your senses' absolute threshold detection. Okay. So a person isn't consciously aware of that stimuli. What am I talking about when I say absolute threshold? Let me elaborate, okay? You'll see this info down here. Your absolute threshold is your sense organ's ability to pick up that stimuli that we talked about earlier, okay, that energy out there in the world, half the time that it's presented, okay? So the minimum amount of energy needed for senses to detect 50% of the time. That's what your absolute threshold is. That's not the same as something else you need to familiarize yourself with, which is difference threshold. Difference threshold is your ability to pick up a distinction or difference between two differing amounts of the same stimuli or two different types of stimuli. Okay, and so those are important differentiations. Absolute threshold would be, for example, the minimum amount of volume that you would need to have going on your computer to hear my voice right now. That would be your absolute threshold for your hearing at that moment. Okay, difference threshold would be your ability to tell the difference between, with your eyes closed, the volume of your computer at 21 versus 22. Okay, so that's difference threshold. So subliminal message deals with the absolute threshold, that minimum level that you need just to be able to pick up a sensory signal to begin with. There's a lot of debate out there on whether subliminal messages can have influence on your behavior. For example, there are numerous scenarios out there of Disney's subliminal messages, for example, where they were supposedly putting, sexual content in these animated movies. That's not true. In every one of the scenarios where you see the most commonly discussed subliminal messages in Disney movies out there on the internet, Disney has incredibly plausible explanations for every single one of them. But there's been ones, for example, Pepsi got into a lot of trouble, I believe it was Pepsi, back in the 90s, where when you would stack some of their cola cans one on top of the other, it supposedly created a sexual subliminal message where it said sex on it. Okay, so there's a debate out there on whether subliminal messages can kind of unconsciously influence your actions. Research shows that subliminal messages can prime you to recognize something later on, but priming doesn't mean like mind control. And then there's no evidence out there that it really can have distinct ability to influence your behavior in major ways like buying habits or voter preferences, okay? But it doesn't stop people from finding them really fascinating. So I'm going to show you a couple of subliminal messages that are out there in logos for companies and sports teams and stuff out there that a lot of you guys probably haven't ever noticed, but that are there nonetheless. So, I'll move myself out of the way. FedEx. Believe it or not, there is a subliminal message here. It's actually this arrow, this white space right here. So remember figure ground that we talked about back with the visual content? So here's this arrow, okay? because their slogan is always on the move. So they have an arrow in there, just hidden under the surface of your absolute threshold. Here's another one, Baskin Robbins. Baskin Robbins is known for having 31 flavors of ice cream. So in the BR up here, you've got 31. So Baskin Robbins, 31 flavors. Here's this one. This is the logo for the Tour de France, which is a big cycling tournament. Okay, so this actually creates a guy on a bicycle. So here is the person. So they've got their legs down, pedaling. You don't see a pedal per se, but they're leaned over on their bike. So here is their first wheel. Here's their bike seat, and here is their second wheel. Okay, so there you go. Toblerone bars. If any of you guys have ever gotten yourself one of these, there is a bear up here in the mountain. Okay, they're up on their hind legs. Okay, and there's their snout, there's their face, their ear, there's one of their bigger paws. So there you go. Toblerone has a subliminal message in it. Jack in the Box is run by a Christian company. So Jack in the Box has this right here. This is the fish symbol. It's technically called the ichthus. So because it is a Christian company, they wanted to put a Christian symbol into their logo. And so that's why they have the ichthus there. Milwaukee Brewers. This is a baseball team. So here is a glove catching a baseball. However, the glove is also made out of the two letters for Milwaukee Brewers. So here is your M right here, and over here is your B. So, little messages even in sports teams. And then you got some of my favorites here. Amazon, everybody's favorite. Everybody thinks that this is a smile. It's not. It's an arrow. Amazon's their tagline, as it were, is everything from A to Z can be found on their website. So here's A to Z. Okay, so that's why they have the arrow going there for Amazon. And then you got the Tostitos logo. You got two people here enjoying a chip with a bowl of salsa. Okay, so all of these are subliminal messages that have been put out there into people, subtle little things in company logos. And so I don't know that this is necessarily going to make you go out and to buy yourself some chips and salsa at present. However, it is an interesting piece of perceptory processes nonetheless. So this is the end of your perception video. If you got any questions, obviously email me and let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day.